I was born into two very traditional Persian families. On my father's side, there was some cultural diversity in that my family of origin on my father's side is from a Jewish heritage. So I had a very broad sense of family, so many uncles, so many aunts, and this is what I remember the most from that family, and going to weddings all the time and to functions, and this was just a beautiful time in my life. On my mother's side of the family, also they were originally from Iran, also of Jewish heritage, and the only difference being that the family had immigrated to France, and so my mother was actually born and raised in France and had that heritage that then she brought back to Iran. This was later in the 40s and 50s. After the German occupation in France, they were forced to move back to Iran. I stepped into this school when I was in 4th grade, and I remember very well being put into a combination. They called that particular class a combination class because it was not quite 4th grade, not quite 5th grade, and in this class I remember there were a dozen students, including myself, and everybody was from a different culture. The international school that I went to offered a very special program that actually gave us the ability to be able to apply and be accepted in many schools in the States. I chose Macalester as well because my brother had come here, and being that far across the world, it made sense to be somewhere where there was family. And this was such an incredible community that all of a sudden I entered, because in a way it had such resonance with the education and the cultural background that I had when I was living in Iran. I come and there was a sense of great international cooperation, and for the students and for the faculty and the community here, it was significant that I had my story. It was significant that I had come from Iran, and that really fostered even more that sense of diversity and internationalism in me. My senior year, I was shocked to find myself all of a sudden not going through the obstacles of living in this community and in this society here, but actually having to find my way with what was going on in my own country. We had the hostage crisis situation at the American embassy, and overnight it changed my life, and overnight the obstacle was really not how I was living here, but how it was that I was going to sort of who it was that I was going to become, and what was my nationality, and where was I. Those preceding years were very difficult. I remember when the political situation in Iran really escalated. For me, the most difficult thing was, of course, my family, and that I came from such a large family, and that everybody was basically split up. And for a long while, my parents were even separated, just until they were able to get their footing. The most significant thing for me was to be able to utilize my education, international education, and that diversity, that sort of interdisciplinary nature of the education that I had received, to be able to sort of bring that into what would be considered my life work. How I see myself is really as a citizen of the world. I have never really felt those boundaries. Yes, I have been caught in cultural upheavals, but I define myself by my connection to family, by my roots, by the community that I have established wherever it is that I have been, and evolving my personal self, kindness, generosity. my contribution would have to be being present enough, being whole enough as the international citizen that I am to, through my presence, soften or dissolve those sense of boundaries that we often feel exist between us and between different nations.
I grew up in Kenya. It was, even on Kenyan standards, it was, average, above average livelihood. And then I finished high school. I passed well enough to go to the local university, but we usually have a 1 year where you had to sit out before going to the university. During that time, my uncle saw an advertisement in the newspaper for a scholarship to go to India. So I applied for the scholarship, which at the time was a bit contentious in the family because my dad thought that was a scam, that people, were just trying to steal money from us. There was a small application fee and my dad did not want me to apply for the scholarship. I applied for that scholarship to a UWC in India, and then I went to India for 2 years. So when I was in India, the plan was to go there for 2 years and then come back to Kenya to do my, to attend university. I was admitted for a civil engineering program. But then when I was in India, most of my friends were applying to American and UK universities. So I also applied for a number of universities in the UK and the US, and then I got admitted to a few. I chose Macalester because they gave me the best financial aid package, and that's how I ended up in the US. Looking back, I think I had a lot more challenges than I thought I did at the time. I think there was a lot of excitement of being in the US, in the land of opportunity. So for example, my accent, people always have a hard time listening to what I'm saying. Intonation is slightly different. I later found out, just recently got engaged. My fiancée said that for the first 2 or 3 weeks we hung out together, she did not understand half the things that I said and she just used to smile. And it seems when you meet somebody for the first time, especially when you come to Macalester, people who have common culture, if you grew up in the US, maybe you like football, maybe you watch The Simpsons, maybe you know what's going on, the most popular TV show at the time. And I remember when I was here my first week, just having a conversation with anyone who had not traveled from outside the country was difficult because, we didn't have much in common. I remember the first time I bought jeans, they were $5, which to me was a lot of money. And I had a hard time buying clothes because the first thing I would do is convert the US dollars to Kenyan shillings, and that would seem like an unreasonable amount of money to pay for clothes. So those were some of the challenges when I first came to the US. Christmas break was another very tough one. Growing up, that was the one vacation or the one holiday that we all spent together as a family. And when you're in Macalester, people go home for Christmas, and you're left alone. And you have some friends coming back who are good friends and they ask you, how was Christmas? You say, Christmas was great. They ask you, oh, did you go home? And you say, no, I did not go home. And they ask you, oh, you don't want to go home and see your family? And that was hard because most of your international students knew, one, you couldn't afford to go to see your family. It's not that you didn't want to see your family, but even sometimes it will probably be easier for your family if instead of going to see them, you send them money. And that was a hard thing. As some of my friends in Kenya would say, now I have the problems of wealthy people, of rich people. Believe it or not, compared to Kenyan standards, I'm very wealthy. I can afford to have a car, Growing up, things like retirement are not things we talked about because you worried about eating food the following day, you worried about school fees. Now, if you don't have savings for 6 months, people look at you like you're irresponsible. So those are kind of the problems I have right now. So I work at the Supercomputing Institute. I'm a bioinformatics analyst there. I like what I do. For the most part, I can say I'm doing well. There's nothing that I want. There's nothing that I need that I can't have. I don't have to worry about not going hungry. I'm at a point where, doing things like yoga or going for vacation seems like, things that I can afford to do and do if I want. And every now and then, when I can, I'm involved with a number of nonprofits. One of them is Kenya Society for Academic Advancement. Until recently, I was the chair for the nonprofit. I'm very passionate about education, partly because I know the only reason that I made it to India and I made it to the US is because I was gifted and I was lucky enough that, education came easy to me. And I think that's an opportunity, especially for kids or people in areas where, the government doesn't work the way it should work. Education is a way of helping people to help themselves.
I was born in Manila, and I was the youngest of 3 children. I have an older brother and an older sister. And growing up, we just had a lot of fun together. We had a lot of pets. At one point, we had 10 cats. So I've always loved animals. My parents both worked as journalists. So when I was in 5th grade, they told me they had been reassigned to a bureau in Jakarta, Indonesia. And at that point, my brother and my sister were older. My sister was already married. So it was just me that went with them because I was the youngest. So I went there the year between 5th and 6th grade. So I went from being a youngest child with 2 siblings and big family to being something like an only child, which was kind of a hard transition at first. I remember missing my brother and sister a lot and having pets. I didn't have any pets when we first came, and I remember that was kind of sad. So I went from a typical Filipino Catholic school from 5th grade to an American-style middle school and high school system, and there are a lot of international students there from all over the world, but a lot of my classmates were American. It didn't take long for me to feel like I was kind of in this space of being in between. I would live in Indonesia, but we were visitors there, and then when I would go back to Manila, it wouldn't be the same. So much would change in between when we were living somewhere else. So after a while, it just didn't feel like either place was 100% home. Because I was in that American school system, and my guidance counselor in high school was from Minnesota, he just recommended that the Midwest was a really good place. And so I wasn't able to do any college visits like most people do, but I got that big Fisk Guide to Colleges book, and I remember just paging through every college and trying to imagine myself having a life there. I think I was mostly excited. My parents were, I'm sure they were devastated, but I was pretty excited to start this new life here. And I remember being cold. I had never seen snow before, so I still remember that first fall. It was, I think, end of October. I had a test to take for one of my classes in the morning, and I went into the room. I took the test, so I was pretty focused on the test, so I spent the whole time writing without looking up. And when it was time to hand the test in to my professor, she pointed out the window and said, "Look, it's snowing." And that was my first time ever seeing snow. Obviously, I'm far away from my family, which has been difficult. But we've come up with our own ways of staying connected. Obviously, Facebook and Skype are wonderful things to stay in touch. In fact, so growing up, we had this tradition of sitting in a circle around the Christmas tree every Christmas morning, and that's when we would pass our presents around. And so every Christmas morning, with the time difference, it's a different time of day here, but every Christmas morning there, we hook up the Skype, and they actually set a place for me in the circle on the laptop, still looking through the presents. So that's a nice way we stay connected. I think coming here to start a life, I grew up in a very close family, so it was difficult to leave them. And also I just had to learn a whole new set of life skills. I feel like I grew up here. I had never really done my own laundry. I didn't have a driver's license. I just learned to drive 4 years ago. For the last 4 years, I've been a teacher at St. Paul Academy and Summit School. I teach in the lower school, so I teach first and second grade students, so very young children. One thing that was important to me during the time that I was getting my naturalization process figured out was I wanted to be open with them about it. And so my students helped quiz me on those civics questions, and I feel like they were just as excited about the process as I was. So on the day of my naturalization ceremony, I couldn't be at school, but the next day I came back and they had written me congratulation notes with American flags and bald eagles, and on the inside every child had written what they think the best part of being a U.S. citizen is. And I thought that was very sweet, and I still have them. I think as a teacher, especially at such a young age, you're not just there to teach them academics, you're also a role model. So it was always important to me that I modeled that openness about my story so that they would always feel empowered to share their story as well.
I was born in Perak, West Malaysia. It's a small state in Malaysia, and a smaller town actually called Tanjung Malim, which is where I was born. And the claim to fame for Tanjung Malim was that it had curfew imposed upon it in the 40s when the Brits were fighting the communists for a week. So nobody could get out of the city and nobody could get into the city. So we moved to Petaling Jaya, Kuala Lumpur in '77. And I went to school in Singapore. So actually, I grew up in Malaysia but went to school in Singapore, and then the four of us, my brother, myself, my father, my mother, we moved to Singapore and we went to school there, and then we performed national service. All the boys in Singapore go through national service for 3 years. Then I went to get my teaching certificate, taught high school, and then there was a shortage of English teachers, so I came here to study English. Very idyllic. Singapore is a very, Malaysia is very, very rural, rustic. Well, those days, not anymore, I suppose. And Singapore is very, very progressive. So I had the best of both worlds, I think. I like to describe myself as a Malaysian at heart, but a Singaporean in my mind, because they're two different types of folks, actually. So there's a contrast between rural and urban, and it was different. I was glad that I was exposed to both growing up in Malaysia and Singapore. My brother had gone the year before to study law in England, and my parents had already retired, so it was time for me to go leave the coop, to say, put it another way. If anything, I was sad that I was leaving my parents behind, which would come back to bug me down the road. But having the opportunity to come to the US and to learn a new subject, meet new people, was really exciting for me. Because I spoke the language, English, it really made it very easy for me to meet people. So there wasn't any problems there. I had an accent, I still have an accent. My kids will tell me very, very clearly that I have an accent to my face. So that was an issue to an extent, trying to get around the accent. My name, Vinod, was hard for very many Americans to pronounce, and that's, in room number 550, Dupre, I was christened Vinny, because they couldn't get to say Vinod after a few years, so they called me Vinny. So there wasn't any culture shock, for want of a better term. I don't think I was depressed, because it was so exciting. I lived in Dupre, the 5th floor of Dupre, 5th East, and I had a lot of friends from Lincoln, Nebraska. So I hung out with them a lot and saw a lot of football games. It's always all my work, my professional career has involved refugee, immigrants, and communities of color. I've worked largely in disparities, health disparities, social services, human services, employment, housing. And I now currently work in educational disparities, looking at how to reduce the achievement gap between white students and communities of color. I find it very, very rewarding. I feel that I've worked with the Somali community for a long time, and I owe a debt to the refugee community. I feel that I've learned so much from them about hope. So it's a humbling career. I've got 2 boys of mixed ancestry, so I try and make sure that they realize that that they have roots both in Asia and here in the US. Mom is from Fargo, North Dakota. I try and make sure that they realize how lucky they are. We do a lot of stuff with refugee immigrant community celebrations so that they are aware of what I do. I think it was hard for me to give up friends in Singapore. It was hard for me to give up my family in Malaysia. It was really hard for me to give up my parents, knowing that they were older. And looking back right now, I still don't regret the decision that I made to come, but I regret the decision that I didn't make enough of an effort to go back to spend time with my parents.
I was born in Taipei, Taiwan in 1984. We lived there until I was 8, and then when I was 8, just before I turned 9, my parents decided to ship me back to the Maldives because they felt like it was time for me to learn Maldivian. I did not have what you call a formal schooling in the Maldives, but I can tell you that the education I received when I lived in the Maldives is one of the most worthy education I've ever received in my life. I was taught Divehi, which is Maldivian, and Arabic by my great-aunt, my grandma. And again, I learned how to climb trees. I learned how to play soccer barefooted, or football as we like to call it. I learned how to tell the difference between a pandan leaf to a curry leaf. I learned how to shred the coconut. I learned how to sew. I learned how to skin a fish. I learned tell the difference between a good egg from a bad egg, so I don't eat the bad egg because it's just rotten. You know, I learned how to watch dolphins and swim in the sea and don't be afraid of new things. So when I came to the United States, I think the first obstacle or the first challenge I faced is that to not being in the majority. Like, granted, I'm biracial, so I grew up in my home countries where the people don't really look like me. And I also live in host countries where even I'm not part of their culture. So there's always an awareness of what it means to be the other. But I think the understanding is mutual, and the understanding was somewhat friendly. And when I first came here, I truly understood what it means to be the other. And and part of that challenge is interacting with people who have very limited knowledge of geography. And I said that in the most endearing sense. Because how I look doesn't necessarily translate to where I'm from. And that totally shakes an American's paradigm when I first came here. I'm a playwright. I started and 5 years ago, I started a middle school theater program. I was invited to really shape and design a theater program for middle school students, 6, 7, 8, in the service of my vision of how I see the world. So many times I think we are asked to regurgitate, memorize and regurgitate, but I'm asking them to be, instead of being assembly worker kind of mentality of education system, I'm asking them to be creators. I'm asking them to be innovators, because I truly, truly believe in the accessibility of a well-rounded education system for every single child. And I really believe that the only way to do it, the only way to grow as human beings, to be responsible, civic-minded, global citizens, is to be able to become innovators and creators.
I have a very rosy picture, a very nostalgic picture of what my country was and what my time there was like. And it really is a paradise. Jamaica is a beautiful place and can be quite beautiful in many other ways culturally as well. It was nice growing up and having parents that did push me to do a lot. You know, we were in a lot of sports, different kinds of arts, and of course, we had to be in school a lot. I did a lot of extra lessons, which is part of why I wished that I had done more of enjoying my country and seeing more of it. When I was actually seriously considering, you know, my course for university versus in the US or in Jamaica, my aunt came to my house with a bunch of applications for the different faculties, and she laid them out in front of me. This is the aunt that was the dean of admissions, and she said, pick one. She's like, you can get into any of them, especially with my help, so pick one. And so I remember thinking, sitting there with these forms on my desk and saying, I have to choose the rest of my life right now, because that's pretty much how it works in Jamaica. And I was 15, and I said to myself, I think I'm smart enough to know at 15 that it's probably a poor decision to choose the rest of my life right now. And so all of a sudden, you know, school in the US started looking really attractive. It was, at the time, I said, who knows what I want to be, right? And Macalester is a liberal arts school that gives me that opportunity, so why not check it out? And I remember looking around and feeling different in the US, you know, that people looked at me a little bit differently. That was one of the first things I started to pick up on as a big cultural difference. What I was realizing was that in my mind, I felt like my box was being framed, and that's the box that you check on the forms when you first start to apply for anything in the US. They ask about ethnicity. I had never been asked that question before in my life. And so I remember looking at the box, and I remember thinking, what do I identify as? So I remember I looked at that box and I said, well, I'm not African American, I'm Jamaican, right? And then there was other. So I checked other, and I wrote in Jamaican/Caribbean Islander, because there was a Pacific Islander. As I said, well, if they can get Pacific Islander, I deserve to have Caribbean Islander as well. It's been an interesting ride, but I like it here. I like the opportunities that I get. You know, I get to do neuroscience, which is my true love in terms of, you know, my career path. I'm very interested in people. So naturally, I want to know what makes them tick, right? And so the most obvious contribution that I will make to the US, and I hope eventually it will be a contribution that I can also give back to Jamaica, is that I further the understanding of neuroscience, and in particular our work at the University of Minnesota and the work I will be doing at Stanford is about understanding traits and trying to establish traits in the brain. Human beings are very complicated. I tend to gravitate towards other immigrants, and so I have a lot of American friends, but a lot of my friends are immigrants, even the ones that are not from Macalester. And I guess, you know, there's something in that shared experience. And, you know, we spend a lot of time together. We go to shows, like some of my friends are in theater, and so we go to plays a lot, and we also go to music events, and I've been very involved in the music community here as well. And I was in Jamaica before I left as well. And so yeah, like, you know, life is a lot of different things. You know, there's school, and I try to balance work and play.
I was born in Lima, and I lived, while I was in Peru, only in Lima. And I remember we first lived with my grandparents. They had my mom's grandparents, and they had a sort of like a pharmacy, a local pharmacy. And when I was really little, like a baby, I would spend my time just sort of hanging around the pharmacy. And even though my grandparents were working, I'd still be there. And my parents worked. They had a long commute, so they they worked very long hours, so I didn't see them that much, but I hung out a lot with my grandparents. And I also had some extended family members that lived around the area. Like my aunt, who was also my godmother, she would take me to marketplaces and sometimes buy me toys, and we'd take the local transport that was called the combi. So it's kind of like a little van that everyone would crowd into, and you'd go in. And I went to school. It was a school, I remember there were nuns in there, so I thought it was run by nuns. And I was there for kindergarten, but I left early because my mom got a student visa to go to Pennsylvania. I remember I had to say goodbye to the people at my school, and they'd say, "Oh, good luck in the U.S., so I knew I was going to the U.S. And so I had to say goodbye to my grandparents too. They accompanied us to the airport. I guess the reasons we went there are mostly economic. My mom felt like she could have a better life in the U.S. When we first got there, I remember I think one of the major issues was getting housing. We rented a van, and I remember we just like went around, we stayed in a hotel. Eventually we found housing kind of like a student apartment. It was very much a change of scenery because Lima's a big city, and we were basically living in a small college town. I don't think I've formally learned any English when I was in Peru because I was still young. I didn't take ESL when I was introduced into the Pennsylvania public school system, but I remember I picked it up really quick, just watching TV, like Scooby-Doo. And yeah, I was very shy and quiet, but English wasn't really an issue for me. So, and then I came to Macalester. I studied international studies. That was my major, and then my minors were anthropology and computer science. I studied abroad in the Netherlands, and my godmother, she currently lives there with my cousins and my uncle, and also my grandparents because they moved there to go be with the new babies. Every couple of weeks I would go and visit them, and yeah, I'd go. I was in Amsterdam. They were sort of near Rotterdam, but I'd just take the train and they'd bring me right there. There's also like farmers markets over there, so it's kind of like, it kind of felt like I was doing similar things like I used to do with them when I was living with them in Peru. And I just graduated in May. I was planning to move back to Pennsylvania. I did AmeriCorps during the summer, so once that was over, I was planning to go back. But I got a job offer, so then I decided to stay here. Pretty much it. I'm still settling into my new life right now, just transitioning from being a student to not being a student and having a job.
My life, I guess generally back home is, I was pretty lucky. My family had always stressed finding opportunities and taking opportunities. And I was in a position where, you know, if I worked hard enough, doors were luckily going to be able to open. So when I was young, when I was in prep school, if I wanted to, you know, focus on playing football and playing cricket and doing classwork, I could do all of those things without having to worry about, you know, going home and not wondering where food was coming from. And so, you know, I think my life growing up back in Jamaica was very fortunate. I was in a position to be able to do and achieve a lot of things. It was a good time. I had a good circle of friends, a circle of friends who were not just Jamaicans, but who came from different parts of the world. And I had had the chance to go to Boston for a summer to do some work at Harvard, to work in their genetics lab and to do some research with the college students and the grad students there. And while I enjoyed the work, while I could do the work, while I could see how the work was going to be rewarding and interesting, I realized that at the end of the day, it just didn't capture me. That I couldn't honestly see myself doing that work for a long time. And so I tried to figure out now, well, okay, I was 17 years old. I'd kind of thought my life was going to go in one direction. I needed to figure out something else now, and I had no idea what to do. What I did know and what I was pretty sure of was that not knowing what I wanted to do, I couldn't stay in Jamaica. So I sent out applications, one of which happened to be to Macalester in good old St. Paul, Minnesota. And the only reason I sent an application here is because one of my best friends from high school had started going to school here 2 years prior. I left everything I knew. And, you know, left my parents behind, left grandparents behind, left my brother behind. And I came here and walked in, and yeah, I knew a couple people. I had a couple friends who were here, and they were older than I was. But you know, I remember going through orientation, this would have been August of 2001, and thinking to myself, I know no one here. I look around at all these faces and everyone was new. And I wasn't home anymore, and it was like, I think in the low 70s, and I had a jacket on, and I was cold. Once school started, it was very clear to me that something that I thought wasn't going to be a shock, being in a class where I was the only black student, was actually something that was kind of a shock to me. I cannot describe to you or even begin to describe to you how weird it was looking around and realizing for the first time in my life that the vast majority of people in here look very different than I do. And trying to work through that as you're trying to pay attention in class, as you're working through all those other things. So right now, I'm an attorney. I'm the associate director at a small nonprofit called the Legal Rights Center, where I, in addition to being responsible for all my criminal cases, I defend people charged with crimes in Minneapolis and Hennepin County. But part of the balance that I'm looking for is not just doing work. I want to be able to do things, other things that fulfill me in other ways, whether that's now boxing, or playing football with people in the community that I now live, or working with the nonprofit I mentioned earlier, doing things here to promote understanding between Jamaicans and Minnesotans, to raise money for different efforts that we have back on the island. Outside of that, I mean, Minnesota is for the most part home. I'm getting married next week. We just bought a house. I've managed to find a very good kind of family structure here. My family's still in Jamaica, but she has a large family, and they're all here. And so they've kind of opened their arms and accepted me. And in addition to having that acceptance at home, being able to work at a place and in a job, doing essentially what I love and really do enjoy, has been very rewarding.
My parents immigrated from India to Kenya. I think they planned to come and teach for a few years and go home, but they ended up staying. And we were born there. My father was a very political person, and he was very, was in the independence movement in India. And when we were brought up there, he decided that we were going to be Kenyan. And one day, I was in Nairobi, downtown Nairobi, with a group of friends, and I lost a dare. And the dare was to go into the US Information Office and say you wanted to go to America at that point. So I lost my dare, and I went in there, and I walked in there, and I said, I want to go to America. And the person over there asked me a few questions and handed me 10 names and said, here, these are the colleges you can go. Things got problematic when admission forms started coming into my family postbox. My family had no idea. Because at that point, and I give my father a lot of credit, he said to me, you're going to make the first adult decision in your life. And your decision is, which country do you want to study with? I will make a decision which college you will go to. And I knew immediately I was going to go to the United States. My father decided that I could not go to any university that was on the West Coast because of Berkeley, and I couldn't go to any college that was on the East Coast because it was near New York, which was evil. So then there was this college called Macalester College, right? And so my father said, well, what are we going to know about it? So he found out a name of an American couple, and he just started right away and said, my daughter is going to the United States, and do you know Macalester College? They said, no, you know. And then he said, well, do you know Minnesota? And they said, yes, but we've never visited. And they said, what do you know about Minnesota? And he said, it's cold, it's very cold. My father said, thank you, and put the phone down. We didn't have clothes for cold climate there. So we ordered wool from Europe. You know, it came by sea, and we had this wool. And so they made up a suit for me in wool, pink wool. So I left for the United States in a wool suit, a zebra bag, gloves, and a zebra hat. This was the 24th of August. I really had no idea I was going so far away. By the time I had to go to England. By the time I got to England, I realized I was inappropriately dressed. I also realized that I was culturally inappropriately dressed. I started, my culture shock hit me there. By the time I got to New York, I was comatose. The time I flew from New York to Minnesota, I think I cried. Just sat there and cried all the way to Minnesota. And you know, I got to Minnesota and people were expecting somebody black. So the people who came to pick me up at the airport went home. So that I came from Kenya. I considered myself Kenyan, but people would expect me to be Indian. And you know, I had a problem, so I had to learn. I had to actually go and start studying about India so I could answer some of these questions, because nobody would accept that I was Kenyan. You know, and it was a very interesting situation to have to live that and figure out what your identity was, and that you had to give up your own identity to meet other people's perception of identity, because it's just easier than having to explain it. I went to graduate school, and I walked into the graduate in New York. I walked into the program, and they looked at me and they said, "Oh, you're not an American." And I said, "No." And they said, "Oh, this program is federally funded, and you can't come into this program." So in effect, suddenly I was out of status because in immigration ways I had to be enrolled in school. In the meantime, Kenya canceled my right of return to Kenya. And this was the time of just after independence, where there was a lot of discussion about what is a real Kenyan, who is a true Kenyan. And it happened that I wasn't home on my 21st birthday and I couldn't register. So essentially they said, we're canceling your right of return. At that point I had a British passport because I was born when Kenya was a British colony, but the British gave us all passports that said no right of abode in the UK. You had a passport, but you couldn't move there, you couldn't live there. And Kenya said, it's not our problem, go to Britain. And Britain said, sorry, it's not our problem, you're Indian. And the Indians said, it's not our problem, you're Kenyan. And the United States said, well, as far as we're concerned, you're out of status, you're illegal, you have to be deported. And then I remembered I'd taken a class with Hubert Humphrey at Macalester in my senior year. So I wrote him a letter. Just said, this is my situation, I don't know what to do. And someone on his staff, actually Mondale's staff, he and Mondale worked very closely, and they called me up and said, we want to help you. And the day before I was to be deported, Humphrey put in a bill in the Senate to keep me in the country. I always had a passion for issues of justice, partly because of the family I came from. And this made me, I didn't think I quite thought it through, but I thought, okay, what I want to do is I want to work across borders, and I want to work with multicultural conflict. And I want to work across identities. I want to figure out how to make this world a place where people feel they belong. There's a certain life, I think, we need for all of us. And I've tried to work very hard to have that kind of world and to do a little bit what I can do to have that world for us.